The serial killer Stephen Port was able to murder 4 men in plain sight, leaving all of his victims within feet of his Barking, East London home. After Port's trial and sentencing, several inquests were convened to look into why the police failed so spectacularly to identify and stop Stephen Port before he became a serial killer. Over the next 2 episodes, I'm going to use the inquest details to track the murders, the evidence, and the investigation to try to understand how the serial killers Bruce McArthur in Canada and Stephen Port in the United Kingdom were able to kill so openly. Thanks for joining me for Stephen Port, Serial Killing in Plain Sight. On January 1st, 2013, an ex-partner of Stephen Port's reported to the police that Port had plied him with drink and poppers and raped him the night before. He told the police that there had been previous similar occasions. This man chose not to pursue the allegation, although he continued to maintain his version of events was true. Records containing this information were kept in the Police National Database. Stephen Port met up with a young man referred to as X3 in the inquest report on several occasions. On June 4th of 2014, Port and X3 were approached by British Transport Police at Barking Station following a report that a male, X3, was being assaulted. Police noted that X3 was clearly under the influence of drugs. Port told the police that they had met on the internet and that he had found X3 outside of his house. Port told the police X3 had taken GHB, and that Port was going through X3's bag looking for his phone. This account was also recorded and made available on the Police National Database. So you have 2 encounters with the police involving Port, sexual assault, and drugs before any of the murders were committed, with the contacts and the incidents available to the police on the national database. 23-year-old Anthony Walgate met Port, who used the name Joe Dean via the escort website Sleepy Boy on June 17, 2014. Walgate had provided his friends with details of the guy he was meeting, along with the address and postcode shown on Port's photo on the site. Mr. Walgate's phone was last used around 11 p.m. as he was arriving in Barking to meet up with Stephen Port. On June 19th, Port rang emergency 999, reporting that he had found a young man collapsed on Cook Street near his home. Port did not give his name, but his number was traced to him, and the police knocked on his door without success. Police found Anthony Walgate's dead body slumped and propped up against a wall outside the entrance of Port's address. The button on his jeans was done up, but the fly was open and broken. Mr. Walgate's phone was missing. The morning Walgate's body was discovered, the police took a statement from Port, in which he related finding Mr. Walgate's body when he returned from work around 4 a.m., which of course was a lie. The truth was, Port hired Walgate, invited him to spend the night at his home. Once Walgate was in his home, Port drugged, raped, and murdered Anthony Walgate, then dragged his body outside of his flat and called the police. A post-mortem was held for Mr. Walgate on June 20th. The findings were consistent with drug use and overdose, but no cause of death could be established. The coroner noted Mr. Walgate's pants were on inside out and back to front. He was wearing a T-shirt which was much too big for him. In addition, the coroner found Walgate had bruising under his arms. Despite these details, when the toxicology results came back, Mr. Walgate's death was ruled a GHB drug overdose. After the Walgate toxicology results were received, D.I. McCarthy, the lead detective in Barking, asked that the matter be referred back to the homicide squad of the Metropolitan Police in London, but the referral was never made. When interviewed a second time, Port volunteered a completely different version of events in which he admitted that he met Mr. Walgate for sex. In this new version, he told the police Walgate became ill and Port left him in his bed and went to work. When he came home, he found Anthony Walgate dead. Port told police he panicked and moved Walgate outside of his front door. When asked why Port panicked, he told police that he thought it would look suspicious like the last time. After that interview, police knew that Port had spent the last 36 hours of Anthony Walgate's life with him and had lied about it. On June 27, 2014, Port was interviewed again by the police, and in that interview, I guess they finally asked him what he meant by looking suspicious, and he told the police he was referring to the X3 incident. Following this interview, Port was charged on one count of perverting the course of justice and was released on bail. Before we move on, let's review what we have so far. The police have in front of them a guy who has prior incidents of rape allegations and assault, accounts that are available to them in their own database. They do not consult these files even after said guy lies to them about the death of a human being found outside of his home. It is Port himself who tells the police about a drug-fueled encounter with the police. And what do they do with all of this information? The answer is nothing. They charge Port with perverting the course of justice without ever running a background check on a guy who moved a dead body and lied to the police about it. A few years ago, the FBI did a study about serial killers, and one of the things that it puts at the top of the list of most important things in investigating serial murders is establishing a pattern as early as possible. If police had consulted their own file on Port, maybe they would have asked themselves, has this guy done things like this before? Or, if he's done this stuff, what else has he done? Answering any of those questions might have put Port on their radar when other young men began to be found dead in Port's immediate vicinity. On August 18, 2014, 22-year-old Gabriel Cavari met Port on the dating site FitLads. Port offered Cavari a room in his flat, rent-free. Cavari moved into Port's flat on August 23, 2014. He sent friends photos he took of Port's flat with a pin drop on the location. Mr. Cavari was drugged, raped, and murdered by Port on August 25, 2014. On August 28th, a dog walker found Mr. Cavari's body in St. Margaret's churchyard, 500 meters from Port's front door. Cavari was in a similar position to that of Mr. Walgate, who had been found with his clothes in a state of disarray. He had all of his possessions with him, but he was missing his phone. His death was declared non-suspicious. Just as in Walgate's case, the final toxicology result indicated a fatal level of GHB. After Gabriel Cavari's murder, Port, under another name, began posting messages to Cavari's Facebook page, a diversion he would use in his other murders. 21-year-old Daniel Wentworth had been in contact with Port on social media since August 2014. On September 18, 2014, Wentworth arranged to meet Port in Barking. Like the other two victims, Wentworth was overdosed with GHB, sexually assaulted, and murdered by Port. His body was discovered in St. Margaret's churchyard on September 20th, 2014. After Wentworth's murder, Port created a Facebook profile of a 21-year-old former porn star from California named John Luck, who lived now in Dagenham near Barking in the UK. The profile was used to mislead people into thinking that Gabriel Cavari and Daniel Wentworth went off to a chemsex party together. A chemsex party is just what it sounds like, a party where sex and drugs, often crystal meth and GHB, are used. If the police had been tracking Port's online activity, they would have found that he mixed his facts with lies. His drugging younger men and his knowledge of both Cavari and Wentworth would have been discovered. At 11:20 a.m. Saturday, September 20th, 2014, poor Barbara Denham, the same dog walker who found Gabriel Cavari's body, discovered Daniel Wentworth in the same location and practically in the same position. Mr. Wentworth was holding what was reported to be a suicide note in a plastic sleeve. The note indicated that Wentworth had taken the life of his friend, Gabriel Klein, a reference to Gabriel Cavari, at a mate's place. The note also referenced having had sex with a male last night. It went on to say that he had taken an overdose of GHB and sleeping pills because he couldn't live with having killed Gabriel. Like the previous two victims, Mr. Wentworth had no phone on him. Wentworth was wrapped in a blue bedsheet. He had a small brown bottle in his pocket like the one found on Mr. Cavari. A post-mortem found bruising under the arms and to the front of the chest. The coroner recommended the sheet be sent for forensic examination. It was not. No cause of death was established. A fragment of the suicide note was sent by email to Daniel Wentworth's father the day after he had been informed of his son's death, followed up by a phone call asking if he recognized the handwriting of his son. His father said he couldn't be sure. However, the officer who spoke to him on the phone said that he had confirmed to her that it was Daniel's writing. From then on, the note was treated as authentic, but it wasn't. It was written by his killer, Stephen Port. When asked at the inquest why the note had not been analyzed by a handwriting expert, as the family was told, the officer replied that it had been looked over by fellow officers at the station and was not sent off for expert analysis. The toxicology results confirmed, like the others, Daniel Wentworth had died from a fatal high concentration of GHB. The investigating officer closed the investigation before he even got the final post-mortem report. This shouldn't come as too much of a shock after what you've heard already, but no family liaison officer, a routine procedure in the UK when it comes to death notifications, contacted the Wentworth family to inform them their loved one had died. His parents learned their son had died when the police showed up at their home to question them about the death. Daniel Wentworth's sister tells a heartbreaking detail of being on the phone with her mother when the police arrived and hearing her mother scream on the other end of the phone as she learned the terrible news. Again, I just want to check in with what we have. 3 victims, all found to have deadly levels of a drug commonly known as a date rape drug. 2 victims found in the same location, 1 not far away. All 3 victims found with no phone, their clothes in disarray, several of them with marks and bruising on their chest and under their arms. So my question is, when does a pattern emerge? After 1 killing? After 2? Surely after 3, and yet the penny still hadn't dropped for the police. Of all of these series of maddening murders, the murder of Jack Taylor is the most maddening of all for me, and perhaps the most preventable. Port was charged with perverting the course of justice on January 27, 2015. He pled guilty and was sentenced on March 23, 2015, and served a jail term of not quite 4 months. He was released on June 4, 2015. CCTV showed 25-year-old Jack Taylor meeting Stephen Port around 2:45 a.m. on September 13, 2015, having met on Grindr in the early hours of that morning. Taylor's body was found against the wall of the same churchyard in a similar position as that of Wentworth and Cavari 1 year earlier. Like the other 3 men, Taylor had no phone. His body was found with a small vial of GHB, a used syringe, some white powder, and a tourniquet. The scene had been staged to make it look as if Mr. Taylor had taken an overdose of drugs. It was Jack Taylor's family who insisted the police check CCTV footage and release that footage to the public. Checking the CCTV footage finally, a connection was made on October 14, 2015, when an officer recognized Port in the company of Jack Taylor. When they finally arrested Stephen Port and inspected his computer, they found images and films that focused on rape and sexual assault fantasies involving young men. On October 5, 2019, Stephen Port was tried and found guilty of 29 charges dating back to 2011, including rape, sexual assault, administration of a substance with intent, and murder. One of the questions swirling around the Port murder investigations is, was homophobia at play in the police oversights? I'll give my impression in a minute, but first I want you to consider a few things. In a report as late as 1999, police officers polled across the UK still equated homosexuality with pedophilia. A 2005 Home Office report indicated that police culture continues to represent a significant barrier to those wishing to see a more open, diverse, and responsive police force. It also suggests that there is now a need to fully explore the nature and extent of homophobia within the police service. I won't go through all of the coroner's inquest conclusions, just some of the highlights. I'll post the entire report on the Panic website. One of the things you need to keep in mind before you hear any of this is that the judge at the start of the inquest prohibited the jury from considering homophobia in their deliberations because of some law that I don't understand. If you do understand it, please post it in the comments. In my opinion, there are risks that future deaths could occur unless action is taken to address those risks. The inquest also noted the possibility of assumptions being made about the lifestyle of young gay men and the potential vulnerability of men cannot be ignored and may reveal that intersectionality was present in policing in 2014, 2015, and there may still be. Finally, and most pointedly, the inquest noted a failure of leadership at the highest levels, a failure to step back and assess what they had, a basic tenet of investigations. Among the failures cited was the failure to check the background of Stephen Port, information available on the police national database. The catalog of failures included the failure to examine Stephen Port's laptop, the failure, once the laptop was examined, to download the content in a targeted fashion, the failure to confirm or refute the details of the fake suicide note, the failure to submit forensic samples. As for the question of how much homophobia was involved in the investigation of these murders, it seems clear to me that there was some sort of bias at play. I think it was a cocktail of budgets, drug deaths, and the bias of thinking that gay guys died doing the stuff gay guys do. Perhaps not a flat-out homophobia, but something combined with other circumstances like drugs, especially drugs associated with gay male partying, that made it easier to come to the conclusion that a gay young man had partied too hard and died. The other question I have is, how much did the notion of the perfect victim influence the lack of investigation or curiosity into these deaths? I know it's an old trope, but I think it really resonates in this case. What would the police have done if they had encountered a dead young woman outside the apartment of her date, only to find that that date had lied to them about how she got there? I think the answer is unavoidable. One of the reasons that I wanted to cover this case using inquest findings was to gain some insight into why this sort of thing keeps happening. Different cities, different countries, time and time again. And I have to say, I'm no closer to understanding why than when I started. As I was ending my research into these murders for this episode, it was announced that another inquest has been convened to take a deeper look at the influences of homophobia on the lack of investigation in the Port serial murders. I'll update you on the findings of that inquest when they become available. Please join me next week for a look into the Toronto, Ontario, Canada serial murders of Bruce McArthur and the oversights made in those murders. If you'd like to learn more about the victims of Stephen Port, please visit the Panic website. The link is in the notes for this episode. Finally, I just want to say I'm so grateful to see the viewership and listeners grow for the podcast and the YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like the video or podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. See you next time.